Welcome back, subscribers, and welcome, new viewers. I'm going to be reading from my Saturn book. This is the fourth request for Saturn, and it's going to be Saturn in Leo and the fifth house. Okay. And I want to thank each and every one of you who have subscribed and who likes and shares my videos, because this definitely, it helps them to circulate to more and more individuals just like you who also are seeking this information. So thank you all so much. And also, any of you who would like a copy of this reading, just let me know. Send me a comment, send me an email. All of my information is always down in every one of my videos drop down box, which is below this video, and all of them. Okay. Under the general umbrella of the fifth house are usually included pleasures and amusements, love affairs, children, creativity and self-expression, and speculation and investments. This is a rather large mouthful for one mundane house, as this house is the reflection of the sun, the symbol for the conscious ego. It might be easier to approach it as the expression of the individual's selfness, those areas where he can be uniquely and wholly himself, where he can permeate his feelings, desires, ideas, and activities with his own essence, and where he is completely unimpeded and uncolored by the necessity for compromise. This is the house of the individual identity, and through the activities of the fifth house, one begins to apprehend, through creative self-expression, the meaning of his own identity. Leo in the fifth house have a great deal to do with the recognition of the self, both by others and by the individual himself. We interpret it also as the house of love, but it might more aptly be called the house of romance, because this also is an area where the individual may express or project his own identity without interference, and through the experience of love of this kind, he may get a glimpse of his own inner center. Love in all its meanings is perhaps as much an archetype as it is the archetype of the self, and neither one is discernible on the birth chart. Only the ways in which they are likely to be approached and expressed are evident, and they are both connected with the fifth house. This house, like the first and the ninth, is also connected with the faculty of the intuition and with the individual's intuitive perception of the purpose and completeness of his total psyche. Expressing through Aries, the individual intuits purpose through his interaction with the environment. Expressing through Leo, he intuits his wholeness through reflecting upon himself as he appears in his own creations. This kind of reflection can lead, in the end, to the experience of the I as a complete and unique idea. But this experience is not approached through the intellect. Otherwise, it becomes a meaningless set of concepts which only serve to throw up more barriers between the individual and his experience of himself. Through an act of creative expression, he may intuitively catch himself being himself. And the importance of this psychological experience should not be underestimated. It is one of the motives behind creativity. It is usual to find the Leonian personality described as egotistical and self-centered. But it might be more correct to say that rather than being self-centered, he is seeking the self at the center. And in consequence, everything that he does is of dramatic importance to him because somewhere in all of it, he senses the responsibility of the direct encounter, the direct experience. Rather than criticizing him for his tendency to exaggerate his own importance, it is perhaps more helpful to realize that no individual can be of any value to himself or to others until he first discovers who and what that self is. Through the fifth house, the individual begins to glimpse himself through those expressions which contain within them a piece of his own unique identity. That's very beautiful. This is not necessarily limited to creativity in the artistic sense, although this is perhaps a more direct form of self-expression. Every individual has some area of life where he is seeking to understand his own significance through completely unimpeded self-expression, whether this is in an artistic field, an intellectual one, an emotional one, or the creation of a living child. From this, it may be inferred that the conventional attitude toward the bearing of children is sometimes in need of some further reflection. Often, the first half of the creative process is accomplished. The child is born. But the second half, the half in which the education and self-recognition of the creator begins, is frequently neglected because this act requires humility of a kind which is usually absent from the parent-child relationship. Children are, in our society, very much a means of living out vicariously through qualities and expressions which are unconscious or have not been permitted to unfold in the life of the parent. Rather than helping to provide a means of self-realization, they are seen as empty vessels which can be molded, shaped, and filled with any content we choose. An act of creativity can always lead to greater self-awareness when we consider who it is that is doing the creating. But it always involves a gamble because the possibility of pride distorting the perception. In any painting or piece of music, there is a fragment of the consciousness of the creator. And in the end, it is for the greater consciousness of his psyche that he creates, not for his audience, although his audience may be a part of the alchemical transformation by which he achieves divinity. This may seem obtruse, but we are fond of tossing about concepts such as God's love for his children and the artist's quest for immortality without having the vaguest idea what we are talking about. It is worth some meditation upon the idea of the creative act and its psychic significance in order to get fuller understanding of the meaning of Saturn in the fifth house. When Saturn is in Leo or in the fifth house, there is a temporary barrier between the person and his self-realization, composed primarily of those shadowy attributes which he will not permit into consciousness. the creative flow is often blocked. Or if it is not blocked, then the experience of self-realization, which is the natural result, may be blocked. The perfect circle of outpouring and inner transformation is interrupted, and the man often pours his energy out and thinks that he receives nothing back because his own sense of inadequacy prevents him from realizing that it has nothing to do with the audience. This applies not only to creative expression, but to romantic love as well. Usually the person with a fifth house Saturn cannot easily find himself among his creations because he has had a minimum of recognition from anyone else. This is the classic indication of the unloved child, the child who may be ignored or treated as merely an extension of his parents, where his own identity and significance have somehow been swallowed up in the trappings of what passes for parent-child love. Children with Saturn in the fifth house are often loved in the sense that their parents love the idea of the child, but they are rarely loved for the unique quality of selfness, which is at the base of the individuality. Later in life, because these children have never experienced the recognition of self by anybody else, they are hard-pressed to recognize it in themselves and often find it difficult to make contact with their own inner significance. The child with Saturn in Leo or in the fifth house must often pay the latter price of intense feelings of inadequacy and insignificance, no matter how many gifts or abilities he may possess. This placement of Saturn often concurs with a reluctance or inability to have children, or the children may bring burdens, responsibilities, or pain. This is the traditional interpretation of a fifth house Saturn. He may deny himself love in the sense that, not loving himself or being able to understand his own value, he is afraid that no one else will find him lovable either. Caught in his own feelings of inferiority, he may be jealous and resentful of others, ensuring the fact of his rejection by them. There is often a stiffness and lack of spontaneity about Saturn in the fifth house. One has the feeling that the individual is always watching himself, and is rarely able to relax. He strains and pushes in the hope, unconsciously, of getting some glimpse of what he truly is mirrored in the loving eyes of others, but he generally consistently fails when he attempts it in this way. Because he pushes too hard, he often alienates those who otherwise might have helped him. His disappointments may come through many channels, but behind the heartbreak, which is often associated with this position, lies the individual's inability to love himself, to recognize his own significance, and to find an inner center which can give his life stability and meaning. And I just feel the need to interject really quickly here that those of you viewers right now who are listening to this, who have this Saturn in the fifth house or Leo, now you can begin to understand where it comes from. And that's what's so beautiful. You're bringing this out into your conscious awareness so that you can begin to start seeing it differently, understanding it, and living differently. Saturn in the fifth house has a reputation for being cold and heartless. But this kind of face is characteristic of Saturn and should not be taken literally. The heart of stone is apparent in many people who are concerned with protecting their own vulnerability with a veneer of callousness. Okay, so those of you who have been told that um, was a personality trait of yours, it's Saturn. It's that energy of Saturn in your fifth house or in Leo. And this is why, because you feel so vulnerable and you're working through getting to know who you truly are and loving who you are. Usually beneath this veneer is a small child who cannot understand his own importance. There's often an intense selfishness exhibited by Saturn in the fifth house and a desperate need to feel important, admired, envied, and popular. Envy is most typical of this position, for the individual who cannot find his own center is often deeply resentful of what he thinks are the meaningful lives of others. To the individual with a fifth house Saturn, everyone else's grass often seems greener. Usually he is most envious of those who seem to attract love, friendship, and affection without having to make the strenuous effort at skill, superiority, and dazzle, which is typical of the fifth house Saturn. No one seeks popularity as audaciously as he does. I don't think that's the right word, audacious. It's not more, just a second. Assiduously. No one seeks popularity as assiduously. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. I apologize if I am not. As he does, whether this is conscious or not, and no one is so crushed and heartbroken when he is not accepted. Saturn is awkward in the sun's sign, and the challenge offered to the person with this placement is a difficult one, for he needs to find his inner center and identify with that rather than the trappings with which he usually surrounds himself. Without these trappings, the person usually feels naked and vulnerable. The opportunity offered, however, is an important one, for if he succeeds in finding his center and manages to shift the focus of his personality from the ego to this more meaningful self, he can begin to recapture the naive joy which is apparent only in a child. The joy which comes from an innate trust in life and in the existence of love in the universe. Oh, that's so wonderful. That's so wonderful. This is what you are capable of. This is what you are working towards. And this is what you will achieve. You will achieve this. You will. Having once found the secret of his own identity, he can never lose it again. Did you hear that? You can never lose it again once you found it. It's yours forever. Oh, wow. And that natural integrity and brightness, which is one of the most endearing of the Leonian qualities, becomes his permanent expression. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. This is all of you. This is all of you. He is no longer dependent on whether others recognize him or not, for he has at least, maybe that too, but it actually says he has at last recognized himself. This experience of contacting the self always seems to evoke the same response in those people who have experienced it. They seem to recapture some of the spontaneous joy, vitality, and innate honesty of the heroes of folklore and fairy tale, regardless of the inhibiting aspects of their outer lives. This joy is not unconscious, however, for the process is a conscious one and is not a regression. Somehow, the duality of conscious sophistication or fine discrimination and unconscious integrity or the sense of trust are fused within the personality. This is a great challenge and an important opportunity, and if taken, certainly balances the pain and loneliness which are usually the initial gifts of Saturn in the fifth house. There is often an interesting blend of inflation and an intense and often crippling shyness apparent with Saturn in the fifth house. The individual both overrates and underrates himself, but rarely perceives himself clearly. Consequently, he cannot see others clearly because he is always projecting his own evaluations onto them, and usually does badly in affairs of the heart because of this. He often cannot express overt affection easily, yet at the same time cannot bear to be ignored. Loyalty and honor may become of exaggerated importance to him, for he often tries to crystallize and solidify the love of others through emphasis on the forms and codes of behavior, which love sometimes takes as its outer expression. It is not so much love in the affectional sense as recognition that he seeks. And it is easy to see why this placement is often associated with those in the entertainment professions. Leo himself does not need this feedback from others. He simply is, and that is enough. Saturn in Leo cannot see the I and must seek it in the applause of the crowd. With this placement of Saturn, the psyche seems to be directed toward a realization of itself, toward a process of individualization, as Jung calls it, and will often not permit the conscious personality to find any solace in the usual activities which supply an identity for most people. Thus, children, who often provide a sense of purpose and significance to their parents, are a disappointment, or there is no possibility of having them. Romantic love rarely turns out to be the ideal, which is expected because the eyes of the lover somehow never reflect that missing flash, which will convince the person of his own value. Creative expression never quite seems fulfilling and usually misses the mark. The individual usually is driven, in the end, to seek himself within himself because no other means are left available to him. It is he himself who has set it up in this way. But to recognize the underlying purpose behind these disappointments is the beginning of wisdom and the final taking of the opportunity. There may be as much overcompensation here as with any other Saturnian placement. Many people with Saturn in the fifth house work very hard at never taking life seriously, although no one is more sensitive, touchy, and serious in the matters of affection than the fifth house Saturn. His fears of rejection and insignificance usually lead him to lace the idea of love heavily with concepts such as loyalty, duty, fidelity, and responsibility, although these may be unconscious lacings. He needs structures so that he may be guaranteed a sufficient amount of enduring love. Unfortunately, no matter how many structures he erects, he usually still cannot trust, and the disguise of frivolity rarely deceives anyone after a while, although he may continue to deceive himself. The heaviness and neediness of this placement usually shows through and because of, the heaviness and neediness of this placement usually shows through. And because of this, the person is often deeply hurt. If the person does not work with his fifth house Saturn, this is a rather unhappy position. Any coupling of Saturn and the Sun carries weight with it, whether this coupling occurs by sign, aspect, or house interchange. All these contacts are connected with the discovery of the self, and this is painful because it involves the tearing away of the veil. We are taught in early childhood that we are many things: our feelings, our beliefs, or bank accounts, or children, or talents, or loved ones, anything and everything except ourselves. The person with Saturn in the fifth house often demands so much from others that he is left lonely and heartbroken. He is capable of much love and devotion, but does not dare to express it without asking for a guarantee back. Only when he recognizes this unconscious process of barter can he begin to free himself of it. We are familiar with the exaggerated display of megalomania, which was expressed by Hitler and which was in part connected with his prominent Saturn in Leo at the midheaven of the birth chart. What is often not recognized is that the ordinary man with Saturn in Leo or in the fifth house, who has no aspirations to conquer the world, may nevertheless have a small share of this desperate need for importance and recognition, coupled with an acute shyness which leads him to wait in the wings when what he wants most is to be at the center of the stage with all eyes focused, adoring upon him. Failing this, he may become a petty tyrant in the home, a hypochondriac, a domestic dictator. The person with Saturn in the fifth house is sometimes not easy to love because he is like a jug with no bottom and absorbs affection and attention endlessly without being satisfied. However, if he begins to understand that his path is inward toward the self, he may begin to see what kind of opportunity is offered to him. For the individual whose heart has been unlocked, every moment contains joy and significance. And although this may sound like the classic mystic's vision, it is also an empiric psychological fact and may be precipitated by certain psychological techniques coupled with insight and patience. Having once seen this vision, the individual needs nothing else to complete himself, for the self is whole. We may observe this motif in many myths and fairy tales, for this is the treasure hard to obtain, the jewel guarded by the dragon, or hidden in the beautiful princess ring. It is the finding of this jewel which seems to be the special task of the person with Saturn in Leo or in the fifth house, for nothing else will suffice. Wow, that's a big one. Very beautiful, though. Okay, well, that's all. You know, I did not share with you the book, the Saturn book. So with the cover, at least the new cover, this is an old book. And in fact, I had the original one, but was unable to retrieve it. So it perished, but okay, so, but it's the same exact one. Again, it's by, the author is Liz Green, Greene, and it's Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. Okay. All right, well, that's all I have for right now. So until next time.